The silk of my skirt snagged on a rusted pipe, tearing with a sound like a scream trapped in a throat. I didn't stop to look at the damage. I couldn't. The labyrinthine service tunnels beneath the Fairmont Copley Plaza smelled of stale grease, damp concrete, and the metallic tang of my own terror. Behind me, the muffled thrum of the engagement party continued, a sophisticated beast that had tried to swallow me whole. I was the guest of honor, the prize filly on display, the daughter of Senator William Evans, and as of 20 minutes ago, the most expensive piece of merchandise in Boston. I pushed through a heavy steel door marked "No Exit," the crash of the bar against my hip sending a jolt of pain up my spine that barely registered. My lungs burned. Every breath was a ragged gasp, scraping against my ribs. I had to get out. I had to disappear before they realized the bride-to-be hadn't just gone to the powder room to touch up her lipstick, but had vanished into the bowels of the hotel like a ghost. My mind kept replaying the conversation I wasn't meant to hear. It played on a loop, a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I had been standing just outside the library, pressing a cold glass of water to my forehead, trying to stave off the migraine that had been threatening me all day. The door had been cracked open just an inch. "She's spirited, William. I'll give her that," Lucas Vane had said. His voice was smooth, like oil slicked over asphalt. Lucas, my fiancé, the man who had courted me with charity galas and orchestrated photo ops. The man I thought was just a boring, ambitious politician. "But are you sure she won't ask questions about the transfer? The accounts are in her name." "Chloe does what she's told," my father had replied. The dismissal in his tone was absolute. It wasn't the voice of a parent. It was the voice of a broker closing a deal. Once the marriage license is signed, the spousal privilege laws kick in. You get the access codes to the offshore holdings, I get the campaign financing from your associates, and if the feds ever look too closely at the Da Vinci laundromat, well, Chloe is the one whose signature is on the restoration contracts. She's the perfect scapegoat. An unstable artist with a history of anxiety? The jury will eat her alive. "And after?" Lucas had asked. "Once the assets are liquidated? Do whatever you want. An accident. An overdose. She's not necessary after the merger is complete." I stumbled, my heel catching on a grate. I fell hard, my knees slamming into the dirty concrete floor of the loading dock. The white satin of my Vera Wang gown, a dress that cost more than most people earned in a decade, soaked up the grime instantly. I scrambled up, ignoring the sting of scraped skin. They weren't just planning a marriage. They were planning a funeral. My funeral. I burst out of the loading bay doors and into the night. The weather had turned violent. A storm had been threatening all afternoon, and now it unleashed its fury upon the city. The wind hit me like a physical blow, icy and merciless. It wasn't just rain. It was a deluge that turned the world into a blur of gray and black. Within seconds, the heavy satin of my dress became a lead weight, dragging me down, clinging to my legs like drowning hands. My hair, pinned up in an intricate chignon with diamond-studded pins, began to collapse, wet strands plastering themselves against my face, blinding me. I kicked off my heels. They were useless now. I ran barefoot onto the asphalt, the rough surface biting into my soles, but the pain was grounding. It was real. The champagne-soaked lie back in the ballroom was the dream. This cold, hard pavement was the reality. I couldn't go to the police. My father controlled half the precinct, and Lucas owned the other half. I couldn't go to my apartment. It would be the first place they looked. I had no phone, no wallet, no ID. Everything was in the clutch I had left at the table. I was a ghost in a wedding dress, sprinting through the back alleys of Boston with nothing but the adrenaline pumping through my veins. Headlights swept across the brick wall to my left. Panic, sharp and electric, surged through me. I threw myself behind a dumpster that smelled of rotting fish and garbage. A black SUV rolled past slowly, prowling. It wasn't a police car. It was an unmarked Escalade with tinted windows. The kind of car that didn't exist on official records. I pressed a hand over my mouth to stifle the sob clawing its way up my throat. They were already hunting. I waited until the taillights faded around the corner before I moved. I needed cover. I needed a place where the senator's influence was weak. a place where the neatly manicured laws of Beacon Hill didn't apply. Instinct, primal and desperate, pulled me toward the north end, the old Italian district. The streets there were narrow, a tangled knot of history and secrets where a limousine couldn't fit, and where shadows were deep enough to hide a woman in white. I ran until my chest felt like it was filled with broken glass. I didn't know how long I had been moving. 10 minutes, an hour? Time had dissolved into the rhythm of my feet slapping against wet cobblestones. The architecture changed around me. The glass and steel of the financial district gave way to red brick, iron fire escapes, and the smell of basil and rain-slicked granite. My vision was spotting. The cold was seeping into my bones, making my teeth chatter so hard my jaw ached. I turned down a narrow street, Hanover, then took a sharp left into a dimmer, quieter alley. I needed to get indoors. Hypothermia was going to kill me before Lucas did if I stayed out here. I looked up at the building in front of me. It was a townhouse, imposing and stoic, built from dark brick that seemed to swallow the light. I recognized the ironwork on the gate. Years ago, before the funding was cut, this building had housed a private archive of Renaissance art restoration techniques. I used to come here as a student to study pigment compositions. I remembered the heavy oak door. I remembered there was a side entrance that used to be left unlocked for the delivery trucks. It was a desperate, stupid hope. The archive had closed 3 years ago. It was likely a private residence now, or gutted and empty, but I had nowhere else. I stumbled up the 3 stone steps, my bare feet slipping on the wet slate. I reached for the handle. Locked. Of course it was locked. Tears, hot and frustrated, finally spilled over, mixing with the rain on my cheeks. I leaned my forehead against the wood, shivering violently. Please, I whispered to the universe, to God, to anyone listening. Please don't let this be the end. Then I heard it. The distinctive, aggressive hum of an engine turning into the alley. I whipped my head around. The black SUV had found me. It crawled toward me like a shark scenting blood in the water. The high beams blinded me, pinning me against the door like an insect on a display board. Terror replaced exhaustion. I pounded on the door with my fist. Open up! I screamed, my voice cracking. Please, help me! The car doors opened. Men stepped out. Not police, not security. These men wore leather jackets and moved with a predatory synchronization that spoke of violence as a profession. I saw the glint of metal in the hand of the lead man. A pistol, held low against his thigh. They weren't here to retrieve a bride. They were here to erase a problem. I hammered on the wood again, harder, until my knuckles bruised. Help! Is anyone there? Please! I heard the heavy click of a deadbolt sliding back. The door swung inward. I didn't wait for an invitation. I practically fell across the threshold, collapsing onto a foyer floor made of polished hardwood. Warmth washed over me, the smell of burning oak, old paper, and something deeper, darker, like sandalwood and tobacco. I scrambled backward, crab-walking until my back hit the wall, clutching the ruined bodice of my dress to my chest. I looked up. The man standing there was not the elderly archivist I remembered. He was a mountain of a man, framing the doorway with shoulders that strained against a white dress shirt. The shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the column of a thick, strong neck. His sleeves were rolled up to his elbows, exposing forearms corded with muscle and dusted with dark hair. In one hand, he held a tumbler of amber liquid. In the other, hidden partially behind the doorframe, was a gun, matte black, steady. He looked down at me. His eyes were dark, almost black in the dim light of the hallway, set beneath brows that were currently drawn together in calculation, not concern. He didn't look shocked to find a half-drowned bride on his doorstep. He looked annoyed. I choked out, water dripping from my hair into my eyes. They're going to kill me. He didn't answer. He looked past me, out into the rain. The sound of boots crunching on gravel echoed from the street. The men from the SUV were approaching. Hey, one of them shouted, his accent thick, guttural. That's our girl. Send her out and we walk away. The man in the doorway didn't flinch. He didn't even put down his drink. He stepped forward, crossing the threshold onto the small porch, placing himself between me and the encroaching darkness. He moved with a lethargic grace that was more terrifying than any sudden movement could have been. It was the confidence of an apex predator who knew exactly where he stood on the food chain. I huddled deeper into the shadows of the hallway, peering around his leg. There were 4 of them. They looked big, mean, and ready to tear this house apart. "You're lost," the man in the doorway said. His voice was a low rumble, a baritone that vibrated through the floorboards and into my shivering body. It wasn't a question. "We're not lost, pal," the leader of the mercenaries sneered, stepping into the halo of the porch light. He raised his gun slightly. "We're cleaning up a mess. The girl belongs to Senator Evans. We have instructions to retrieve her. Give her to us, and you don't have to deal with the fallout." The man took a slow sip of his whiskey. He swallowed, the movement of his throat hypnotic in the tension. "You must be new to Boston," he said, his tone conversational, bored even. "Or you would know that this house sits on Ravellini ground." The air in the alley seemed to freeze. Even I, sheltered in the suburbs and art galleries, knew that name. Ravellini, the family that ran the North End, the family that the police didn't touch, that the politicians didn't cross without permission. The mercenary leader hesitated. His gun lowered an inch. "We have a contract, and I have a headache," the man replied. "You stepped onto my property. You threatened a guest on my doorstep. In my world, that's not a contract dispute. That's a death wish." He didn't shout. He didn't posture. He simply existed with such absolute, suffocating authority that the violence in the air shifted. It wasn't directed at me anymore. It was radiating from him. "Turn around," he commanded softly. "Get back in your cheap car. Drive until you cross the city line. If I see your taillights in 5 seconds, I won't paint this street with your brains." The mercenary locked eyes with him. It was a test of will, a silent measurement of lethality. The mercenary blinked first. He cursed in a language I didn't recognize, Albanian maybe, and signaled to his men. They holstered their weapons, their body language shifting from aggression to survival. "This isn't over," the mercenary spat, backing away. "It is for you," the man said. He waited. He watched as they piled back into the SUV. He watched as the engine roared to life, and the vehicle reversed aggressively out of the alley, tires screeching on the wet stone. Only when the street was empty again did he turn back to me. He stepped inside and closed the door, the sound of the heavy locks snapping into place. 1, 2, 3 clicks was the loudest thing I had ever heard. It sounded like a cell door closing, but for the first time in hours, I was on the safe side of the bars. He loomed over me. Up close, he was devastating. His face was all sharp angles and hard planes, a jawline that could cut glass, and a mouth that looked like it rarely smiled. There were no scars on his face, nothing to mar the severe classical beauty of his features, but his eyes were old. They were the color of espresso, dark and impenetrable, and they were scanning me with a clinical precision that made me feel naked, despite the layers of wet silk. He looked at the mud on the hem of my gown. He looked at the bruises forming on my wrists where I had gripped the door. He looked at the diamond engagement ring that was still sliding around on my wet finger. "You're bleeding," he stated. I looked down. There was a cut on my arm I hadn't noticed, the blood swirling with the rainwater on my skin. I fell in the tunnels. "Who are you?" "Chloe," I whispered. My teeth were chattering so hard I could barely form words. The adrenaline was crashing, leaving me shaking violently. Chloe Evans. Recognition flickered in his eyes, but it wasn't surprise. It was calculation. The senator's daughter, the one who was supposed to marry Lucas Vane tonight. I flinched at the name. "Please, don't call them. Don't call the police. They'll kill me. My father, he's selling me. It's a setup." He stared at me for a long moment. He could have thrown me out. He could have called my father and ransomed me back for a fortune. He was a criminal. I knew what the Ravellini family was. They were monsters. But looking at him, I didn't see a monster. I saw a fortress. He set his whiskey glass down on a side table. He didn't offer me a hand to get up. Instead, he reached for a thick, dark towel that was hanging on a coat rack nearby. He dropped it onto my head. It was heavy, warm, and smelled like him. "Stand up, Chloe," he ordered. I struggled to my feet, my legs wobbling. The wet dress weighed 50 pounds. I clutched the towel around my shoulders, shivering. "Are you going to send me back?" He stepped closer. He was so tall I had to crane my neck to look him in the eye. He reached out, his hand large and warm, and brushed a wet strand of hair away from my cheek. His touch was rough, calloused, but surprisingly gentle. His thumb grazed my jawline, tilting my face up to the light. "Out there," he said, his voice dropping to a rough whisper that traveled straight to my marrow. "You are currency. You are a problem to be solved or an asset to be liquidated." He leaned down, his face inches from mine. I could feel the heat radiating off him. But here, his eyes locked onto mine, demanding total submission, total honesty. "Here, you are under my roof. And the Ravellinis protect what is theirs." My breath hitched. "I'm not yours. You knocked on my door," he murmured. "You crossed my threshold. Fate brought you here, but I am the one deciding to keep you." He stepped back, gesturing toward the interior of the house, a dark, sprawling expanse of shadows and luxury. "Stay with me," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a command wrapped in a promise. "Stay with me, and they will never touch you again." I looked at the door behind him, the barrier between me and the storm, between me and the death that awaited me at the hands of my own father. Then I looked at him, Marco Ravellini, the wolf who ruled the city. He was dangerous. He was lethal. But in his darkness, there was a strange, terrifying safety. I tightened the towel around myself, feeling the first returning sensation in my frozen fingers. I took a step toward him. "Okay," I whispered. He didn't smile. He just nodded, once, sharp and final. He turned and walked into the darkness of the house. And without looking back, he expected me to follow. And I did. The whiskey burned. It was a sharp, amber fire that coated my throat and settled in my empty stomach like a heavy stone. But it was the only thing keeping the tremors at bay. I sat in a high-backed leather wing chair that probably cost more than my entire tuition at the Restoration Institute, clutching the crystal tumbler with both hands. The library of the townhouse was vast, a cathedral of dark mahogany and shadows, illuminated only by the dying embers in the fireplace and a single brass lamp on the desk. Marco Ravellini stood by the window. He hadn't moved for 5 minutes. He was watching the street, his back to me, a silhouette of broad shoulders and coiled tension. He had discarded his jacket, and the white dress shirt stretched across his back as he crossed his arms. He hadn't asked me if I was cold. He hadn't asked me if I was hungry. He was letting me stew in the silence, waiting to see if I would crack. "My father isn't going to stop," I said. My voice sounded foreign to my own ears, raspy, hollow, stripped of the polite cadence I had been trained to use at political fundraisers. "He has the entire Boston PD in his pocket. If you think the Ravellini name is enough to keep him away forever, you don't know William Evans." Marco turned slowly. The movement was fluid, predatory. He walked to the desk, poured himself another drink, and leaned against the heavy wood, crossing his ankles. He looked at me over the rim of his glass, his dark eyes unreadable. "I know your father, Chloe," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. "I know he votes against organized crime bills in public and takes kickbacks from the Albanian mob in private. I know he's desperate, but desperation makes men sloppy. And tonight, he was very sloppy." He set the glass down with a sharp clink. "But I don't run a charity for runaway brides," he continued, his tone hardening. "You brought heat to my doorstep. Serious heat. I need to know why. Why would a senator sell his only daughter to a man like Lucas Vane? What is so important that he would risk a federal kidnapping charge to get you back?" I took another sip of whiskey, the alcohol finally numbing the stinging scrape on my knee. I looked around the room, my eyes landing on a painting hanging above the mantel. It was a portrait of a merchant, styled in the Dutch Golden Age tradition. The light, the shadow, the texture of the velvet coat. It was masterful. "That Vermeer," I said, pointing a trembling finger at the canvas. Marco glanced at it, a flicker of surprise breaking his stoic mask. "What about it?" "It's a fake," I stated flatly. He raised an eyebrow. I paid $3 million for that at a private auction in Zurich. It has papers of authentication from the Rijksmuseum. The papers are forged, I said, the professional part of my brain taking over, pushing the fear aside. Look at the craquelure near the hands. The cracks are too uniform. They fan out in a spiderweb pattern that suggests rapid thermal expansion. That canvas wasn't aged by 400 years of Dutch air. It was baked in a convection oven in a basement in New Jersey about 10 years ago. And the blue pigment on the coat, it's synthetic ultramarine. Vermeer used crushed lapis lazuli. The light refraction is completely different. Marco stared at the painting, then back at me. A corner of his mouth ticked up. It wasn't a smile, not really. It was an acknowledgement. Go on, he said. That's what I do, I told him, meeting his gaze. I'm a restorer. I specialize in provenance and layer analysis. My father, he owns a gallery. The Evans Collection. It's a front. For years, he's been having me restore works of art. He brings me pieces, tells me they need cleaning or relining. I didn't ask questions. I was just happy he was paying attention to me, happy to be useful. I swallowed hard, the bile rising in my throat. I wasn't restoring them, Marco. I was preparing them. He and Lucas, they use the paintings to transport information. Microfilms, digital drives, bearer bonds, hidden between the original canvas and the lining, or buried under layers of new gesso and overpaint. They ship the art internationally for exhibitions. It bypasses customs. No one scans a 16th century masterpiece for data smuggling. Marco went still. The air in the room shifted, becoming heavier, charged with a sudden, lethal intensity. He understood. He wasn't just a thug with a gun. He was a strategist. He saw the board. And tonight? He asked softly. I overheard them. I whispered. I wasn't supposed to be there. They were discussing the merger. My marriage to Lucas wasn't about politics. It was about consolidating the assets. Once I signed the marriage license, spousal privilege would prevent me from testifying if the feds ever found out. And once the transfer was complete, once the Da Vinci Project was fully laundered, you become a loose end, Marco finished. They were going to kill me, I said, the words tasting like ash. An overdose. An accident. It didn't matter. I was just the packaging for the deal. Marco pushed off the desk and walked toward me. He stopped inches from my chair, invading my space, forcing me to look up at him. He didn't touch me, but his presence was overwhelming. He smelled of rain and violence. Do you know which paintings? He asked. I know all of them, I said, my voice gaining strength. I know the chemical composition of the solvents needed to strip the layers without destroying the evidence. I know the shipping schedules. I know where the bodies are buried, Marco, because I'm the one who unwittingly dug the graves. I stood up. My legs were shaky, but I locked my knees. I wouldn't cower. Not anymore. I was done being a victim. You want to hurt Lucas Vane? I asked. You want to cripple my father's operation? I can give you the map. I can decode every single piece of art they have. And what do you want in return? I want to live, I said. And I want to burn their world down. Marco studied me for a long moment. He looked at my ruined dress, my wet hair, the fire in my eyes that mirrored his own. He reached out and took the empty glass from my hand, setting it aside on a bookshelf. Deal, he said. There was no contract, no handshake, just that single word, heavy with obligation. Pack your things, he said, turning toward the door. Then he paused. Wait, you don't have things. We're leaving. Now. Leaving? I asked, panic flaring again. Where? This townhouse is burned, Marco explained, checking the magazine of his pistol before sliding it back into his holster. Your father knows you're in the North End. He won't strike tonight because he's scared of a war. But by morning, he'll have a judge sign a warrant. We're going to the main estate, my territory, the only place in Massachusetts where a senator's badge means nothing. He didn't grab my arm. He didn't push me. He opened the door and waited. It was a choice. I could walk out into the rain and take my chances, or I could walk with him into the belly of the beast. I walked with him. The drive was a blur of rain-streaked windows and silence. We took a different car, a heavy armored sedan that felt more like a tank than a luxury vehicle. Marco drove with one hand on the wheel, his eyes constantly checking the mirrors. He didn't turn on the radio. He didn't try to make small talk. I sat in the passenger seat, watching the city fade away. The skyscrapers of Boston gave way to the winding, dark roads of the North Shore. I should have been terrified. I was sitting next to the capo of the Ravellini crime family, a man rumored to have killed people with his bare hands. But looking at his profile in the dashboard lights, the sharp nose, the set jaw, the focus, I felt a strange, jarring sense of calm. For the first time in my life, the person beside me wasn't trying to manipulate me. He was just guarding the perimeter. We pulled up to iron gates that were easily 12 feet high. They swung open automatically as the car approached, revealing a long, winding driveway lined with ancient oaks. The Ravellini estate wasn't a house. It was a fortress masked as a mansion. Stone walls, slate roof, security cameras blinking red in the darkness of the trees. Marco parked in front of the main entrance. Men in dark suits materialized from the shadows before the engine even cut out. They weren't the disorganized thugs my father hired. These men were disciplined. They nodded to Marco with deference. "Boss," one of them said, opening Marco's door. He glanced at me, his expression impassive. "Is this the package?" Marco stepped out and walked around to my side. He opened my door before I could reach the handle. "She is not a package, Dante. She is a guest. Alert the perimeter team. We go to condition red. No one enters or leaves without my direct verbal authorization. If you see a badge, you lock the gates. If they try to breach, you hold the line." "Understood," Dante said, his eyes widening slightly at the escalation. Marco led me inside. The foyer was breathtaking. Black and white marble floors, a double staircase, a chandelier that looked like a cascade of frozen tears. But I didn't have time to admire the architecture. "The kitchen is through there," Marco said, pointing. "Get some food. Real food, not those canapes you were starving on." "Then go to the study. Second door on the left." "I'm not hungry," I lied. "You're running on adrenaline and whiskey," he corrected me. "You eat. That's an order. I need you sharp, not fainting." He didn't wait for an argument. He turned and marched up the stairs, barking orders into a cell phone he had pulled from his pocket. 20 minutes later, I walked into the study. I had forced down a sandwich made by a silent, efficient housekeeper, and the sugar from the bread was finally clearing the fog in my brain. The study was the nerve center of the house. Screens covered one wall, displaying security feeds and stock market tickers. Marco was there, standing in front of a massive flat-screen television tuned to a national news network. He had changed his shirt, putting on a fresh black button-down, but he hadn't rolled down the sleeves. "Look at this," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. I looked at the screen. My stomach dropped. It was a press conference. My father, Senator Evans, was standing at a podium, looking disheveled and distraught. A perfect performance. Lucas Vane stood beside him, looking grim and supportive. "My daughter, Chloe, has been struggling with severe mental health issues for some time," my father was saying, wiping a non-existent tear from his eye. "The stress of the wedding. It caused a psychotic break. We believe she has been lured away by a dangerous criminal element who is taking advantage of her fragile state. She is not herself. She is confused, paranoid, and in need of immediate medical attention." The camera zoomed in on Lucas. "We just want Chloe home," Lucas said, looking directly into the lens. His eyes were cold, dead sharks swimming in blue water. "Chloe, if you're watching, please, take your medication. Come home. We love you." "Lies," I hissed, my hands balling into fists. Every word. "I don't take medication. I've never had a break." "They're setting the narrative," Marco said. "They're delegitimizing anything you say before you even say it. If you go to the press now, you're just the crazy girl ranting about conspiracies." On the screen, a reporter asked a question. "Senator, are there any leads on who she might be with?" "We have reason to believe she is being held against her will by Marco Ravellini," my father said, his voice trembling with fake rage. "A known crime boss. Let me be clear. If anything happens to my daughter, If a single hair on her head is harmed, I will bring the full force of the United States government down on his head. There will be no trial. There will be war. Marco didn't speak. He picked up a heavy crystal ashtray from the coffee table. He didn't throw it with wild anger. He threw it with terrifying precision. The heavy glass smashed into the center of the 80-inch screen. The TV exploded in a shower of sparks and plastic shards. The image of my father's lying face distorted, fractured, and then died into blackness. Silence rang in the room. Marco turned to me. His chest was heaving slightly, the only sign of the fury burning inside him. He thinks he can threaten me in my own city, Marco said, his voice low. He thinks he can use you as a shield. He walked over to a large oak table in the center of the room. He swept a pile of maps and ledgers onto the floor with a violent swipe of his arm. Come here, he commanded. I walked to the table. You said you have a map, Marco said, placing his hands flat on the wood. You said you know the operation. I do. Draw it, he said. He grabbed a tablet from a side table and slid it toward me. Right now. Show me everything. Where are the paintings? Who are the buyers? What is the timeline? I picked up the stylus. My hand hovered over the digital screen. This was it. The point of no return. Once I wrote this down, I was an accomplice. I was betraying my blood. I was declaring war on my father. I looked at Marco. He wasn't looking at the tablet. He was looking at me, waiting, not forcing me, but witnessing me. You're not a prisoner here, Chloe, he said, reading my hesitation. The gates open from the inside, too. You can walk away. But if you stay, you fight. Can you do that? I thought about the medication comment. I thought about the years of being told to sit still, look pretty, and sign the papers. I thought about the cold, damp tunnel and the way Marco had stood between me and the mercenaries without blinking. I'm not walking away, I said. I touched the stylus to the screen. The shipment leaves on Thursday, I began, sketching the layout of the gallery warehouse. They're moving 12 crates. But the real money isn't in the crates. It's in the centerpiece for the auction, a painting called The Silent Madonna. It's supposed to be a restoration of a Renaissance piece. And it's not. No, I said, drawing a diagram of the frame structure. It's a vault. The canvas is lined with lead. Underneath the oil paint, in the texture of the dress, that's where the ledger is. Not just money. Names, agents, judges, everyone on Lucas's payroll. Marco watched the lines appear on the screen, his mind working as fast as mine. He leaned in, his shoulder brushing against mine. The heat of his body was distracting, grounding. If we get that painting, Marco murmured, we don't just stop the money, we own them. Yes, I said, but it's heavily guarded. It's at the Lombra Gallery, underground, high security. I don't care if it's in the Vatican, Marco said, straightening up. His eyes were dark fire. We're taking it. He looked at me, really looked at me, seeing not the ruined bride, but the architect of his victory. You need clothes, he said abruptly, the intensity shifting from war back to logistics. You can't plan a heist in a wedding dress. I don't have anything. I'll have my sister send things over in the morning. For now. He walked to a closet in the corner of the room and pulled out a black t-shirt and a pair of gray sweatpants. He tossed them to me. Wear these. The guest suite is next to mine. Try to sleep. I caught the clothes, clutching them to my chest. Marco? He paused at the door. What? Why did you break the TV? I asked softly. You didn't have to do that. He looked back at the shattered screen, then at me. His expression softened, just a fraction. I don't like liars, he said. And I didn't like the way he looked at you, even through a screen. He opened the door. Get some rest, Chloe. Tomorrow we steal a masterpiece. He left, closing the door softly behind him. I stood alone in the study, surrounded by the wreckage of the television and the blueprint of my betrayal. I looked down at the black shirt in my hands. It was soft cotton. I brought it to my face. It smelled like sandalwood and rain. I wasn't safe. I was in the center of a hurricane. But for the first time in 26 years, I wasn't just a doll in a box. I was the one holding the match. And Marco Ravellini had just given me the gasoline. The tiny earpiece hummed with static against my ear canal, a constant buzzing reminder that I was no longer Chloe Evans, the runaway bride. I was an operative, a weapon, a thief. I stood in front of the floor-to-length mirror in the guest suite of the Ravellini estate. But the reflection staring back was a stranger. Marco hadn't sent for a stylist or a personal shopper. He had sent a tactical team disguised as tailors. The dress wasn't chosen for its beauty, though it was devastatingly elegant. A column of midnight black silk that fit like a second skin. It was chosen for its engineering. The slit on the left side went high up my thigh, not to tease, but to allow for a full range of motion if I needed to sprint. The bodice was reinforced, tight enough to hold the wire running down my spine, but flexible enough to allow deep breaths. And the shoes. They looked like jagged stilettos, weapons in their own right, but the soles were lined with a red, grippy rubber compound usually found on combat boots. "Turn around!" Marco's voice came from the doorway. I spun, my heart doing a traitorous double tap against my ribs. He was leaning against the doorframe, dressed in a tuxedo that cost more than the gallery we were about to rob. The black tie hung loose around his neck, yet to be knotted. He looked lethal. Civilized, yes, like a panther in a diamond collar, but lethal nonetheless. "The wire is visible near the neckline," he noted, pushing off the frame and walking toward me. He didn't ask for permission. He stepped into my personal space, the scent of sandalwood and gun oil enveloping me instantly. His large, warm hands brushed against the bare skin of my neck, sending goosebumps cascading down my arms. He tucked the thin wire beneath the silk strap, his fingers lingering for a fraction of a second longer than necessary on my pulse point. "Your heart is racing," he murmured, his voice low and rough, vibrating through my chest. "I'm about to rob my father," I whispered, meeting his dark gaze in the mirror, and infiltrate a room full of people who think I'm currently having a psychotic break in a padded cell. "You aren't robbing him," Marco corrected, his eyes locking onto mine in the glass. "You are reclaiming what was stolen. And you aren't Chloe Evans tonight. You are Elena Koval, a private equity investor from Zurich, with a taste for religious iconography and a mute husband. You're not going to talk? My accent is too distinct," Marco said, finally tying his tie with efficient, sharp movements. "In Boston, a Ravellini voice opens doors, but it also triggers alarms. Tonight, I am merely the muscle and the wallet. You are the face." He turned me around to face him, his hands settling heavily on my waist. The heat of his palms seeped through the silk, branding me. "Listen to me, Tesoro," he commanded, his intensity stripping the air from the room. "We are walking into the lion's den. L'Ombra isn't just a gallery, it's a bunker for the corrupt. Lucas will be there. Your father might be there. If you freeze, we die. If you panic, we die. You need to turn off the part of you that is a daughter and turn on the part of you that survived the tunnels." "I can do it," I said, though my voice trembled slightly. "I know you can," he said. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, sleek object. A UV flashlight, no bigger than a lipstick tube. He pressed it into my hand. "Find the painting. Verify the lead lining. Signal the team. Then get behind me." He offered me his arm. "Shall we go to the ball, Cinderella?" The drive to the financial district was silent. We didn't take the armored tank this time. We took a sleek, silver Aston Martin that blended in with the excess of the event. L'Ombra was located in the sub-basement of a skyscraper that housed 3 hedge funds and a law firm specializing in acquittals for the guilty. The elevator ride down was a descent into a different world. The doors slid open to reveal a cavernous space of polished concrete, exposed industrial pipes painted gold, and walls lined with art that was meant to intimidate rather than inspire. The lighting was low, amber and moody, designed to make the jewelry of the guests sparkle and to hide the flaws in the merchandise. "Stay close." Marco breathed into my ear, his arm tightening around my waist. We stepped into the crowd. It was a sea of masks and malice. This was a masquerade auction, a convenient affectation that allowed the city's elite to indulge in their vices anonymously. I adjusted the black lace mask over my eyes, grateful for the barrier. The air smelled of expensive champagne, ozone, and the metallic tang of avarice. I scanned the room, my professional eye automatically cataloging the art on the walls. It was a graveyard of forgeries and stolen masterpieces. To my left, a Basquiat that had clearly been painted by an art student in a loft in Brooklyn. To my right, a legitimate Roman bust that had been reported stolen from a dig site in Italy 4 years ago. Focus. Marco's voice crackled in my ear, though he was standing right beside me. Target is on the north wall. We moved through the throngs of people. A judge I recognized from the nightly news nodded at us. A tech billionaire raised a glass. They saw the tuxedo and the dress, the posture of arrogance, and accepted us as one of their own. It was sickening. Then I saw it. The silent Madonna. It was displayed on a standalone easel in the center of a velvet-roped area, bathed in a focused spotlight. It was grotesque. Not the painting itself. It was a technically proficient imitation of a Raphael Madonna. But the context. The face of the Madonna was serene, her hands clasped in prayer, but the texture was wrong. Even from 10 feet away, I could see the unnatural heaviness of the canvas. It didn't drape. It stood rigid. "It's here," I whispered, barely moving my lips. "We need to get closer," Marco replied. "I need you to verify the lining before we cut. If we slice into a decoy, the alarms trip silently and the doors seal." We began to move toward the ropes, but the crowd parted suddenly, creating a wide berth. My blood turned to ice. Lucas Vane was walking toward the exhibit. He wasn't wearing a mask. He didn't need to. His arrogance was his disguise. He looked impeccable in a midnight blue tuxedo, a glass of scotch in one hand, his other hand resting possessively on the shoulder of a young, terrified-looking intern who was holding a catalog. "Ladies and gentlemen," Lucas announced, his voice smooth and projecting easily over the murmur of the room. "Thank you for joining us for the highlight of the evening, the Silent Madonna, a piece that represents purity, sacrifice, and silence." He laughed at his own joke. The room tittered nervously. I stopped walking. My breath hitched. He was right there, 20 feet away. The man who had planned my death. The man who had looked me in the eye and told me he loved me while signing off on my murder. "Chloe." Marco's voice was a sharp command in my ear. "Don't look at his face. Look at his tie. Look at his shoes. He is just a target. He is prey." Marco's hand slid from my waist to the small of my back, his thumb pressing hard into my spine, grounding me. The pain was sharp and necessary. It pulled me back from the precipice of panic. "I'm okay," I breathed. "He's distracted," Marco noted. "He's preening. Move to the left flank. Use the sculpture for cover." We drifted to the side, slipping behind a massive abstract bronze sculpture that looked like twisted wreckage. From this angle, we were in the shadows, just outside the direct line of sight of Lucas's security detail. 2 men standing by the pillars, looking bored. "Now," Marco said, "I'm going to create an opening. When the glass breaks, you move. You have 3 seconds to check the canvas with the UV. Do not hesitate. What are you going to do? Something clumsy." Marco detached himself from me. He moved toward a waiter carrying a tower of champagne flutes. He didn't shove the man. That would be too obvious. He simply extended his foot. A subtle, calculated trip at the exact moment the waiter turned. The result was spectacular. The waiter stumbled, the tray tipped, and 50 crystal flutes crashed onto the polished concrete floor with the sound of a shattering chandelier. The noise was deafening in the hushed gallery. Champagne sprayed onto the gown of a senator's wife. People gasped, shouted, and surged backward to avoid the glass. The security guards turned their heads. Lucas turned his head. "Go!" Marco hissed in my ear. I moved. I didn't run. I glided, crossing the distance to the velvet rope in 2 long strides. I ducked under the rope. I was now in the spotlight. I pulled the UV light from my clutch, thumbing the switch. I pressed the light against the bottom corner of the painting, where the paint was thinnest. A dull, sickly green fluorescence reflected back. Not the purple of canvas, or the white of gesso. Green, the specific chemical reaction of lead treated with a shielding agent. "It's confirmed," I said, my voice shaking with adrenaline. Lead lining, it's the vault. Step back, Marco ordered. He was there instantly. He had used the chaos of the crash to ghost through the crowd. He vaulted the velvet rope with a fluid grace that belied his size. In his hand, a scalpel appeared, surgical steel gleaming under the gallery lights. He didn't hesitate. He slashed the canvas. It wasn't a random tear. It was a precise rectangular incision around the central figure of the Madonna. The sound of the thick, lead-lined canvas ripping was visceral, like skin tearing. A collective gasp went up from the room. "He's destroying it!" someone screamed. "Security!" Lucas roared, his composure shattering. Marco ripped the center of the painting free. He didn't look at the art. He looked at what fell out from behind the lead sheet, a thin, flat packet wrapped in mylar. He snatched it up and shoved it into his jacket pocket. "Move." Marco grabbed my hand. The spell broke. The security guards drew their weapons, tasers and batons. Guns were too risky in a crowd of donors, and charged. "Kitchen!" Marco shouted, pulling me toward the service doors to the right of the exhibit. We sprinted. My heels slammed against the concrete, the red grip soles doing their job. We hit the double swinging doors of the kitchen just as the first taser prong whizzed past my ear, embedding itself in the doorframe with a spark. The kitchen was a labyrinth of stainless steel, steam, and shouting chefs. We burst through, startling a line of cooks plating appetizers. "Out of the way!" Marco roared, his voice booming over the clatter of pots. We wove through the prep stations. The exit was at the far end, past the dishwashing pit. But as we rounded the corner, the rear exit door burst open. 2 men in suits blocked the way. These weren't gallery security. These were professionals. Evan's personal detail. "Nowhere to go, Ravellini," the larger one snarled, snapping an extendable baton. Marco didn't slow down. He didn't even pause to negotiate. He released my hand. "Get the door code," he ordered me. "I'll handle the trash." I scrambled toward the keypad next to the locked loading dock door. The red light blinked mockingly. I needed a 4-digit PIN. Behind me, the sound of violence erupted. It wasn't the cinematic fighting of movies. It was brutal, ugly, and fast. I heard the crack of bone, the wet thud of a fist hitting a kidney. I glanced back for a second. Marco had ducked under the baton swing, trapped the man's arm, and used the man's own momentum to drive his face into the stainless steel counter. The man crumpled. The second guard lunged at Marco with a knife. "The code, Chloe." Marco grunted, dodging the blade by an inch. "Think, what does your father love?" My mind raced. My birthday? No, he barely remembered it. His anniversary? No. The date he was elected? Too public. Then I remembered the painting, the fake Vermeer, the date on the fake authentication papers. 1665. I punched it in. 1 to 6 to 6 to 5. Electronic buzz. Access denied. "Wrong code," I screamed. Marco caught the knife hand, twisting the guard's wrist until I heard a sickening snap. The guard screamed, dropping the weapon. Marco kicked him in the chest, sending him flying into a rack of drying pots. "Try again," Marco yelled, backing toward me, breathing hard but uninjured. "Think like him. What is his password for everything?" I closed my eyes, visualizing my father's office, his safe, his ego. It wasn't a date. It was a number. The number of votes he won by in his first landslide victory. The number he bragged about at every dinner party. 2412. I keyed it in. The light turned green. The heavy hydraulic lock hissed. "Got it." I shoved the door open. Rain and cold night air blasted into the hot kitchen. We spilled out onto the loading dock. The alley was dark, slick with oil and water. "Where's the car?" I gasped, looking around. The Aston Martin was parked blocks away. We couldn't go back to the front. "There!" Marco pointed to a nondescript gray sedan idling halfway down the alley. "Plan B." We ran for it. But the back door of the kitchen slammed open again. Lucas Vane stood there. He wasn't holding a drink anymore. He was holding a gun. A silver revolver that looked too large for his manicured hand. "Chloe!" he screamed, his voice cracking with rage. You ungrateful bitch! He raised the gun. Marco didn't dive for cover. He stepped in front of me, shielding my body with his own. He raised his own weapon, the Beretta he had pulled from his waistband. Lucas fired. The shot went wild, sparking off the brick wall 3 feet to our left. He was panicking. He wasn't a shooter. He was a politician. Marco didn't miss. He fired 2 shots. Not to kill. Too much paperwork. Too much heat for a public figure. He shot the ground in front of Lucas, sending shards of concrete flying into his shins, and then he shot the light fixture above the door, plunging the dock into darkness. Car! Now! Marco shoved me toward the driver's side of the gray sedan. Me? I yelled. I need to cover the rear. You drive. I didn't argue. I threw myself into the driver's seat. The keys were already in the ignition. I twisted them, and the engine roared to life. It was a sleeper car, shabby on the outside, modified racing engine on the inside. Marco dove into the passenger seat just as I slammed the gear shift into drive. Go! 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 I floored it. The tires spun on the wet asphalt, smoking, then caught traction. The car fishtailed violently, missing a dumpster by inches, and shot out of the alley onto the main street. Left, Marco shouted, checking the side mirror. We have company. I glanced at the rearview mirror. 2 black SUVs were peeling out of the garage exit behind us. The mercenaries. Hold on, I gritted out. I took the corner onto Congress Street at 60 miles an hour. The back of the car swung out, drifting. I steered into the skid, correcting with a reflex I hadn't used since the defensive driving course my father made me take, after a kidnapping scare when I was 12. They're gaining, Marco said calmly. He rolled down his window. The wind and rain whipped into the cabin. He leaned out, bracing his arms on the doorframe, the Beretta steady in his grip. Bang, bang, bang. The shots were deafening inside the car. Behind us, the lead SUV swerved. Marco had hit the front tire. The massive vehicle lost control, hydroplaning across the lanes and slamming into a parked delivery truck with a crunch of metal that vibrated through my steering wheel. One down, Marco said, pulling back inside and rolling up the window. He looked at me. There was no fear in his eyes. There was something else. A wild, electric approval. You drive like a getaway driver, he noted, sounding almost impressed. I learned to drive so I could run away from him, I said, my knuckles white on the wheel. I just never had a place to run to until tonight. We sped through the red light at the intersection, leaving the chaos of the financial district behind. The adrenaline was starting to shake my hands, but the car was steady. Where are we going? I asked, my breathing ragged. The estate? No, Marco said, checking the packet he had stolen from the painting. He tucked it safely into the glove compartment. The estate is too obvious. They'll expect us to go to ground. We're going to the safe house in the Berkshires. It's off the grid. No cameras, no satellite linkage. He reached over and placed his hand on my thigh, his thumb rubbing soothing circles against the tense muscle. The touch was grounding, pulling me back from the edge of hysteria. You did good, Chloe, he said quietly. You didn't freeze. I wanted to, I admitted. When I saw him, when I saw Lucas, I wanted to throw up. But you didn't, Marco said. You acted. That's the difference between a victim and a survivor. I looked at him for a split second. Before turning my eyes back to the rain-slicked road, he was right. I had walked into the lion's den. I had looked the monster in the face, and I had stolen his prize. The painting, I asked. What's in the packet? Marco opened the glove box and pulled out the mylar envelope. He ripped it open. Inside wasn't money. It wasn't a ledger. It was a stack of transparent films, microdots. It's not just names, Marco said, holding one up to the passing streetlights. These are schematics, blueprints. For what? For a building, Marco said, his voice turning ice cold. A federal building. Chloe, they aren't just laundering money. They're selling infrastructure vulnerabilities to foreign cells. This isn't corruption. This is treason. The weight of what we had just done settled over us. We hadn't just robbed a gallery. We had just intercepted an act of war. They won't stop hunting us now, I whispered. They can't. Good, Marco said, racking the slide of his empty gun to reload a fresh magazine. Because I'm tired of running. He looked at me, his eyes dark and promising violence. Let them come, he said. We'll be waiting. I pressed the accelerator harder, the engine growling in response. The city lights faded into the rearview mirror, replaced by the encroaching darkness of the highway. I wasn't the senator's daughter anymore. I wasn't the runaway bride. I was the driver of the getaway car, and for the first time in my life, I was choosing the direction. The gray sedan crunched over gravel and dead leaves, the headlights cutting through the relentless curtain of rain that had followed us all the way from Boston to the Berkshires. We were miles from civilization, deep in a forest that felt ancient and indifferent to the violence we had just escaped. The safe house wasn't a cabin. It was a bunker dressed up in cedar and stone, squatting low against the earth as if trying to hide from the sky itself. Marco killed the engine. The silence that followed was heavy, ringing in my ears after hours of the roaring engine and the phantom echo of gunshots. We're clear, he said, his voice rougher than usual. I looked over at him in the dim light of the dashboard. He was gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles were white. But it wasn't anger. It was pain. His left arm was held rigid against his side, and a dark stain was spreading across the sleeve of his tuxedo jacket, turning the expensive fabric slick and black. You're losing blood, I said, my voice snapping into the clinical tone I used when assessing a damaged canvas. Panic was a luxury I couldn't afford. Not when the only thing standing between me and a shallow grave was currently bleeding out in the driver's seat. It's a scratch, Marco grunted, opening his door. Grab the packet from the glove box. It's not a scratch, Marco. You took a knife meant for my throat. He didn't argue. He stepped out into the rain, moving with a stiff, guarded gait that terrified me more than if he had collapsed. Marco Ravellini was a force of nature. Seeing him vulnerable felt like watching a mountain crack. I grabbed the stolen microdots, shoved them into my pocket, and followed him. The interior of the house was cold, smelling of stale air and pine. Marco punched a code into a keypad by the door, and the security lights flickered on, revealing a space that was utilitarian and stark. Leather furniture, bare walls, a kitchen that looked like it had never been used. There were no personal touches, no photos, no life. This was a place people came to survive, not to live. Marco walked straight to the kitchen island and leaned heavily against the granite counter. He hissed a breath through his teeth, his face paling beneath the tan. First aid kit, I demanded, throwing my wet jacket onto a bar stool. Where is it? Bathroom. Under the sink, he managed to say, his eyes closing for a brief second. I ran. I didn't just walk. I sprinted to the bathroom, falling to my knees to wrench open the cabinet. It wasn't a standard drugstore kit. It was a trauma bag. Suture kits, coagulants, morphine, sterilized scalpels. The tools of his trade. I grabbed the bag and a bottle of rubbing alcohol and ran back. Marco had managed to peel off his jacket. His white dress shirt was ruined, the entire left sleeve saturated with blood. He was trying to undo the buttons with one hand, his fingers clumsy and shaking slightly. Stop, I ordered, moving into his space. Let me. He looked at me, his dark eyes hazy with pain but still sharp with that intense, unnerving focus. He dropped his hand. I stepped between his legs, my fingers working quickly to undo the buttons. I peeled the wet, bloody cotton away from his skin, wincing as the fabric stuck to the wound. The gash was ugly, a jagged slice running 4 inches down his bicep, deep enough that I could see the red rawness of the muscle beneath the subcutaneous layer. It was bleeding sluggishly now, but it was wide and angry. This needs stitches, I said, examining it with the same detachment I used for a torn Renaissance tapestry, and it needs to be cleaned. It's going to hurt. Do it, Marco said. He gripped the edge of the granite counter with his good hand, his biceps flexing as he braced himself. I washed my hands, snapped on a pair of latex gloves from the kit, and poured the alcohol over the wound. Marco didn't scream. He didn't even groan. His jaw clamped shut so hard I saw a muscle feather in his cheek, and a sharp intake of breath hissed through his nose. His body went rigid, hard as stone against my hip, but he didn't pull away. "Breathe," I whispered, dabbing the wound with sterile gauze. "You have to breathe, Marco." "I'm fine," he ground out. "You're a terrible liar." I threaded the suture needle. My hands, which had been trembling on the steering wheel an hour ago, were now perfectly steady. This was mechanics. This was repair. I knew how to stitch canvas to hold for centuries. Skin wasn't so different. "I need you to stay still. If you move, the scarring will be worse." "I don't care about scars," he murmured, watching my face instead of his arm. "I do," I said softly. "I spend my life removing them from things that are beautiful. I pierce the skin." He flinched. Just a microscopic tremor, but held his ground. I worked methodically, tying off each knot with precision. The silence in the room was intimate, heavy with the sound of the rain drumming on the roof and our synchronized breathing. "Why do you do this?" I asked, needing to fill the silence, needing to distract him from the needle sliding through his flesh. "The crime, the violence. You aren't like the thugs my father hires. You're educated. You have an eye for art. You could have been anything." Marco watched my hands. "I wasn't the heir," he said, his voice straining as I tightened a stitch. "My brother, Santino, he was the golden child. He was being groomed to take over, to legitimize the family. I was the spare. I went to university. I studied architecture." I looked up, surprised. "Architecture?" "I wanted to build things," he said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips, bitter and fleeting. "Structures that lasted. Things that couldn't be corrupted." "What happened?" "Santino was soft," Marco said, his face hardening. "He thought he could negotiate with wolves like the Albanians. He thought honor meant something to them. They killed him 6 years ago. My father, he broke. He couldn't lead. Someone had to step in. Someone had to burn the wolves to keep the pack safe. I tied off the final stitch and snipped the thread. So you became the monster to fight the monsters." "I became what was necessary," he corrected. He looked at the neat row of black sutures on his arm. "Just like you became the perfect daughter to survive the senator." I stripped off the gloves and threw them in the trash. I poured whiskey onto a clean cloth and wiped the blood from around the wound, my touch gentler now that the work was done. "I wasn't a daughter," I said, my voice quiet. "I was an asset, a portfolio. My father didn't see me. He saw a merger opportunity. He saw a way to hide his sins." Marco reached out with his good hand. He caught my chin, tilting my face up until I was forced to look at him. The intensity in his eyes burned away the cold of the room. "I see you," he said. The air left my lungs. It wasn't a line. It wasn't a manipulation. It was a fact, stated with the same absolute certainty he used when he ordered men to die. "You didn't flinch in the gallery," he murmured, his thumb brushing over my lower lip. "You drove through a firefight. You just sewed me up without shaking. You aren't an asset, Chloe. You're a weapon he didn't know how to wield." "Marco, he wanted to sell you," he growled, the anger vibrating in his chest. "He wanted to give you to a man like Lucas Vane, who would have broken you just to see the pieces shine. The thought of him touching you, of anyone touching you." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. He pulled me closer, his hand sliding into the wet hair at the nape of my neck. The distance between us vanished. The smell of him, antiseptic, blood, sandalwood, and raw male heat, flooded my senses. My hands found purchase on his bare chest. His skin was fever hot. I could feel the heavy, powerful beat of his heart against my palms. "I'm not afraid of you," I whispered, the realization crashing over me. I should have been. He was a killer. He was dangerous, but he was the only thing in the world that felt solid. "You should be," he said, his voice dropping to a rough whisper against my mouth. "Because once I kiss you, I'm never letting you go. There is no going back to the gallery, no going back to the life you knew. You stay with me, in the dark, in the blood, always. I don't want to go back," I breathed. "I want to stay." He didn't wait. He crushed his mouth to mine. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was acclaiming. It was a collision of two people who had been running on the edge of a cliff for too long and finally decided to jump. He tasted of whiskey and danger. His tongue swept into my mouth, demanding, taking, possessing. I made a sound in the back of my throat, a whimper of need that I hadn't known I was capable of making. My fingers curled into his shoulders. I pulled him closer, needing to eliminate every millimeter of space between us. He lifted me, effortlessly. Despite the wound, despite the blood loss, he hoisted me up onto the granite island. He stepped between my thighs, pressing his hips against mine, the hard ridge of his desire undeniable against the thin fabric of my sweatpants. Mia Regina. He groaned against my neck, his teeth grazing the sensitive skin there. My queen, you belong to me. Say it. I'm yours. I gasped, throwing my head back as his lips trailed fire down my throat. I'm yours, Marco. He stripped the shirt off me. The air was cold, but his hands were searing. He looked at my body, not with lust, but with reverence, like I was the masterpiece he had stolen, the only thing of value in a world of fakes. Beautiful, he breathed. Perfect. There was no fumbling, no awkwardness. It was primal. When he entered me, I felt it in my soul. It was a grounding, an anchoring. The storm outside raged, wind battering the windows, but in that kitchen, on that cold granite counter, I was burning. We moved together in a rhythm that was frantic and desperate, a reaffirmation of life in the face of the death we had narrowly escaped. Every touch was a promise. Every kiss was a seal. I wrapped my legs around him, pulling him deeper, wanting to absorb his strength, his darkness. I wanted him to mark me, to change me, so that no matter what happened tomorrow, I would never be the same again. When the end came, it shattered me. I cried out his name, my body bowing off the counter, burying my face in the crook of his neck. He followed me seconds later, a guttural roar tearing from his throat as he poured himself into me. We stayed like that for a long time, tangled together, breathing hard, his forehead resting against mine. The adrenaline had faded, replaced by a heavy, languid exhaustion. But the fear was gone. I wasn't alone anymore. Eventually, Marco pulled back. He kissed my swollen lips, then my forehead. He didn't pull away emotionally. He just adjusted my shirt, covering me with a tenderness that made my chest ache. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice rasping. "Yes," I said, and I meant it. He hopped off the counter and helped me down. His arm was bleeding again, a small spot of red blooming on the gauze, but he ignored it. "We need to see what we have," he said, the soldier returning to duty, but he kept his hand on my lower back, keeping me connected to him. We walked to the living area. Marco retrieved the packet of microdots from the table where I'd left them. He pulled a specialized laptop from a secure case under the sofa, a military-grade machine that looked like it could survive a bomb blast. He sat on the leather couch and pulled me down next to him. I leaned my head on his shoulder, watching the screen boot up. "It's old tech," Marco noted, holding one of the films up to the light. "Analog storage, smart. It can't be hacked remotely." He slipped the film into a specialized scanner attachment on the side of the laptop. The screen flickered, blue code cascading down the terminal. "Here we go," he muttered. An image appeared on the screen. It was a digital scan of the documents hidden in the painting. My heart hammered. This was it. The proof. But as the file opened, a red box flashed on the screen. "Encryption detected. Biometric key required." "Damn it," Marco cursed softly. "What?" I sat up. "What does it mean?" "It means the data is scrambled," Marco said, pointing to the chaotic jumble of characters on the screen. "Your father isn't an idiot. He didn't just hide the files. He locked them. See this algorithm? It's a dual-key system. We have the data, but we don't have the Rosetta Stone to read it." "Is it a password?" I asked. "A number?" "No." Marco shook his head, frustration tightening his jaw. "Look at the prompt. Insert physical token. It's a hardware key, a drive, a chip, something physical that completes the circuit." I closed my eyes, visualizing my father's office, his habits. He wears a necklace, I said slowly. A silver chain. He never takes it off. There's a pendant on it. It looks like a chess piece, a black rook. Marco looked at me. A rook? Yes. He told me it was a family heirloom. But the Evans family were farmers, Marco. They didn't have heirlooms. He touches it when he's nervous. He was holding it tonight during the press conference. That's it, Marco said. That's the key. The USB drive is inside the pendant. So we have the lock, I said, a cold dread settling